Okay, good morning. My name is Ben Bingle. I'm the director of the DeKalb County Nonprofit Partnership at the DeKalb County Community Foundation. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar on storytelling. A couple of housekeeping items before we get started. First, we're going to be sending today's webinar to all of you later on by email. We'll also include an evaluation form in that email so you can give us feedback about today's training. We have everyone muted, but please feel free to use Q&A and chat features that are built into Zoom. We'll save some time at the end to address any questions that you submit. If you're more comfortable, you can also send those directly to me in the chat, and I'll moderate that Q&A session. Like usual, we'll plan for about 45 minutes of content and then allow 10 to 15 minutes for questions and discussion. So with that, we're excited to welcome back Matt Gayer, who's led a variety of DCMP webinars for us since 2020. And I know he's coming to us live from New Orleans today. So he's joining us from his hotel room there. So we appreciate his flexibility, and I'll share a little bit about his background with you all now. Matt's the co-executive director of the Catalog for Philanthropy in Washington, D.C., which is the region's only locally focused guide to giving and volunteering. They focus on small nonprofits with the goal to create visibility for these organizations, to fuel their growth with philanthropic dollars, and to create a movement for social good in the region. Since 2003, the Catalog has raised more than $40 million for their network of vetted nonprofits. Before joining the Catalog, Matt worked in healthcare consulting at the advisory board company. He's a Truman Scholar, holds a master's of public administration with a focus in nonprofit management from Syracuse, and he earned a bachelor's in public policy and political science from Southern Methodist University. Welcome, Matt. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Excited to talk to you all day about, this is a topic that I rarely go a full webinar without talking about storytelling anyway. So a lot easier when that's the core topic that we're talking about. So excited to dive into this with you all. I do apologize, my audio is a little echoey. It's a hotel room, as Ben mentioned, so the audio is a little off, but hopefully that's okay for you all today. So when we think about storytelling, there's a couple things I'll say before we kind of dive in, and we'll talk about two big parts of storytelling today. One, we'll talk about how to tell really effective stories, right? What are audiences looking for? How do I communicate that story to my audience? What is going to be most effective to achieve my goals when it comes to communication with storytelling? The second piece we'll talk about today, equally important, is how do I actually collect and manage those stories, right? So even if I have a great idea for what story I want to tell, if I can't actually get some stories from my work, from my staff, from my clients, I'm not going to have much to say, right? So we'll talk about that during the second half of the webinar today. In general, when we think about storytelling, always really critically important, but especially so right now. We'll talk about audience a couple times today, so I won't go too much into it right this second, other than to say the fact that we know that there's a lot of investment and engagement in what's happening in the community right now by our audiences. But there's also a lot of folks that have a lot going on. They're busy, they're stressed, right? So we really have to think about how to most effectively communicate to them. A couple of things about storytelling right now, this year, towards the end of the year. We know that part of this, right, and we'll get to this during the second half of the webinar today, is about managing and collecting those stories. We need staff to help provide those to us. We need staff to help collect those. And our teams are tired. There's a lot going on, a lot being asked of them. So we need to make it as easy as possible to get those stories from staff. And we'll talk about how to do that a little bit later. Stories are something that we see really engage folks on digital platforms. So a lot of times when we look at social media posts, email campaigns that are the most successful, especially in the nonprofit sector, they're story-based, right? The things people are sharing, commenting, liking on, wanting to engage with is usually based on a story. And then finally, it's really important too, as we are, especially right now, going into end of year, not just telling stories to tell them, but telling them for a goal. So we'll talk about some of the things we can use stories to do here in a minute, but we want to make sure those stories are focused and that they're building on each other. So diving on in here, and again, most folks probably know and understand that stories are important, but a couple of things that drive that home real fast. One of the biggest things we see is that stories stick with folks. So often you're going to remember a story you hear longer than you'll remember a stat or just a mission statement or a vision. So with the fact that people are so busy, have so many messages hitting them at the same time, right? Especially this time of year for the nonprofit sector, those stories we tell are going to help stick with folks a little longer. And that can make the difference between someone donating a couple days later to us after they read our email versus not, right? So that retention is really important there. It inspires folks to do things. So again, looking at social media, that digital platform that we're engaging on, right? Stories are often why, the majority of the time, why people actually do something like donate. So whether it's donate, volunteer, just go to your website, stories are usually behind that driver of action, more so than some other forms of data or communication points we might be making. It's not just important externally. Internally, stories really tell our staff about our environment, our culture, our priorities, our values. So we want to use stories to build that internal culture as well. And then finally, it's hard to communicate without stories, right? If you think about your normal day, think about some of your interactions with your peers, your colleagues, your family, you're probably telling stories most of it, right? The majority of what we say to each other are stories. So it's natural for a brand that wants to be authentic and personal, which all of our brands should be trying to do right now. It's a huge trend in marketing. We see audiences want brands to be personal and authentic and approachable. Stories are critical to that if we're going to do that well. So again, as I said, the first part today is going to dive into how to tell our story, what our audience is really looking for out of a story, how do we craft a compelling story. Then the second part today will be about how do we manage and collect those stories overall. So the first tip for the storytelling piece is really just to remember your audience, right? So at the end of the day, and this is true of almost any communication topic we would ever teach or talk about, it's going to be audience first, right? Who are we trying to talk to? What do we want them to do? And then we figure out how to do it. And that's going to be the same for our stories as well, right? So thinking about our audience first, when we're beginning to think about what stories we want to tell, how to craft them, what do we know about our typical audience right now? And this is true in general for community members who are invested and interested in what's happening locally. They care about local nonprofits already, right? So often this is the audience that we're trying to communicate to or already have captured on our email newsletter, social media audiences, etc. We see in general folks that care about local community are really invested right now. So we still see volunteer rates be pretty high. Giving is still elevated right now. And we see in general a desire from the audience, from the community, to know what's happening on the ground, especially as there may be national debates about different issues, right? Different levels of faith and trust in the news, right? And things being reported. They want to know from you what's actually happening in my community, right? What's happening in our region? What's happening down the road or near where I work, right? Or the place I drive by on a regular basis. So folks want to know and they're invested in that. So they're looking for that information and they'll engage with it if given. At the same time that that's true, it's not all a rosy picture. We also know our core audience is very distracted right now. And that's true for a lot of reasons. One, just an inundation of information. It's true for all of us, right? But especially folks that are invested and engaged in the community are getting a lot of information from a lot of sources, a lot of news, a lot of updates, a lot of emails. Social media, right, has never been more active. So all that to say, we are going to be a small drop in the bucket of all the communication they get, especially over the next couple of months. So we need to think about that. In addition, that distracted nature kind of comes from the fact that just like probably most of us on the call today, folks have a lot of things going on. There's economic uncertainty, right? Jobs are really busy. They're still recovering and moving out of the last couple of years of uncertainty and change. So we see a lot of folks are struggling to really kind of latch onto a couple different sources of information. So it's important that we're thinking about how to make it easy for folks to see the information we're sharing, especially over the next couple of months. And then finally, across both these things, right, they want to know what's happening on the ground. They have a lot going on. Overall, though, they still want that sense of connection and relationship. There's not necessarily more social isolation than there was a few years ago, but people are more aware of it, and they're more aware of not feeling connected to their community, even if they're equally disconnected than they were a few years back. So folks are looking for communication, for stories, for things they can do to feel a part of their local community, part of their local region, connected to their neighbors. And your communication, your storytelling you can do, inviting them in to volunteer, to donate, to participate is one way to build that community. That's what audiences are looking for. So given this, we have an engaged audience that wants to connect but has a lot going on. We're going to talk about what stories are going to work best for folks right now. And the first thing we're going to talk about there is why you're sharing stories in the first place, right? So we're not just doing this to do it. We're not just putting stories out because it's a best practice, or we heard it's a good idea, or because we like to share stories, right? We're doing this for a goal. We want our audience to do something, and that's why we're sharing stories. And what that goal is going to impact the type of story that we're going to share, right? So not all stories are created equally. Some are meant to engage and excite you. Some are meant to really make you think or reconsider a position about something. Some are meant to drive you to action. And depending on what that goal is, it's going to impact what story we tell and how we tell it. So a couple of goals we may have here. One, we might have a goal to shift mindset, right? To make people reconsider a belief or a notion that they currently hold. So this is often to get the audience to think about an issue or a population differently. Maybe to become aware of an issue or population that they may not be actively currently. And for this, if this is our goal, right, to get people to start thinking about something differently, we want to focus on a story with a really strong narrative arc. So what I mean is that there's a clear path of change or progress, right? It started here, ended here, and we can paint the picture of how it got there. So it's going to be really important that those stories are very detail oriented. They're very specific. They can still be anonymous. We'll talk about that. I know it's a common question for folks that work with protected populations, aren't able to share directly individual stories because of that. But we want to share a lot of details here too. So details and a clear arc are going to help people begin to, it's obviously a slow process, but begin to change or at least consider shifting their beliefs or their ideas about an issue, a population, a community, et cetera, that we might be working with. Our goal here is to introduce them in the story to a common challenge. We want to relate the challenge the population is facing back to a challenge they may have in their own life, and then provide resolution. And when we say resolution, we'll talk about this later as well. It doesn't mean that everything has to be solved, tied with a bow on top, right? It just means that there's progress that has been made. Our second goal, and this is probably the goal we're going to see most often for us when we're telling stories as nonprofits, is getting the audience to do something, right? So to take an action. And again, this is the most common story told, or most common goal, I should say, for storytelling. So the stories we'll describe are the most common ones we see shared. This is going to be really important to focus on stories with strong characters or emotions. So what's going to drive people to take that personal action is a personal connection to the story. So folks that get connected to the character, to the emotional arc, right, of the story, those are going to be the ones that are really active. We want to make sure that in these stories, we actually end with a call to action. So not letting people kind of fill in the blank for themselves of like really great story, really great character connection, and then, hey, do you want to do anything, and let them choose. We want to include a call to action at the end, right? So really great emotional kind of connecting story, and then saying, and we need you to step up to volunteer, donate, learn more, advocate, etc. Whatever it might be, whatever action you're asking them to take. And we want to relate the story to the audience in some personal ways. And how we do that is really talking about the character, talking about some choices they're facing, right? Some opportunities or challenges that they're facing, and taking those out enough that they seem universal, right? So while the audience may never have faced the exact challenge or choice that the character of the story is, they may have faced a similar dilemma, right? They may have faced a similar resource constraint, right? Or an A or B choice, right? Or had something kind of hanging in the balance there. So it's important we think about how we focus on characters, emotions, and then relating those challenges or opportunities back to the audience that we're trying to drive action. And then finally, our goal with storytelling may be to create connection, right? So to that point earlier about the audience wanting community, it may be directly to that, right? Trying to get the audience to feel connected to each other, to the community at large, to the organization, to our clients. So we want to get the audience to feel like part of something. And this is where we can really use, and we'll talk about the types of stories here in a second. We can focus on stories from staff and supporters, right? So not every story we share has to be an impact story from a community member that we're working alongside, right? Those are obviously the stories that we do see motivates donors and other supporters the most. So we're going to want a lot of those stories to share, and especially when we're thinking about action and mindset, those are going to be vital for really doing that successfully. But when we're thinking about building community as well, those also work. And if we're going to do that, again, strong central characters are really important. But also those stories from donors like them, volunteers like them, staff and their perspective, right, on the issue or the population they're serving or the organization overall, or what it means to them to get support from the community, from donors and volunteers. A board member story, right? Any of those stories are going to be helpful for other community members to see themselves in the story, right? Oh, this is a story from a donor. I too could be a donor, right? I too could be a volunteer. Maybe I could be a board member. The more we're telling those stories, the more they're going to see themselves in that, feel connected to it. It's also going to let them know that we are grateful for those supporters, right? That we lift those stories up, that those are important to us. So there's a lot of benefits of sharing those in terms of kind of creating connection, but also helping people want to see themselves as a supporter if they're currently just a prospect. For our story itself, so we set a goal, right? We're choosing a story to tell. And again, we'll talk about managing and collecting stories a little bit later. So this is for any one individual story that we're dealing with. I want to answer 3 big questions for any story. And every story we tell is going to have these kind of 3 elements to it. One, it really needs to answer the question of who, right? So even though we may not specifically call out, we want to have an identified audience in mind when we're telling it. So that's our who that we're answering. And we want to make sure that there's a well-rounded and compelling character at the heart of the story. And again, this doesn't have to be some heroic tale. It doesn't have to be something that we really kind of embellish, right, or add a lot of flourish to. This can just be a real story about someone kind of facing an opportunity, a choice, making progress, making a decision, engaging with the program, etc. But we want to make sure that we're really telling the personal story of that, and not just saying, this student passed a test, right? We want to add a little more detail to that and kind of connection to that to really create that personal connection to the person we're talking about. Secondly, in addition to that who, which is probably the most important piece, honestly, in nonprofit storytelling, is the who, because that personal connection we see really motivates donors and volunteers. Second, though, is the how, right? So this is the what actually happened. So this is back to that narrative arc. Again, going to be really important in mindset shift stories, but really in any story that we're telling. We want to make sure effective stories have a beginning, middle, and end. And that may feel obvious, but what we mean by that and kind of where that nuance really comes in, it separates okay stories from great stories, is a very clear and catching beginning, right? A very detail oriented. We may even have less details throughout the story, but a lot of details at the beginning because we want to set the scene. It's really important for the majority of folks are visual learners, and while you won't be able to show them the story per se, we can paint a picture for them that even though they're reading it or maybe watching a video of it, they can at least in their mind's eye kind of put together kind of where this was happening, right? And kind of what the situation looked like. From that beginning, we get to the middle, right? So this is the main part of the story, including the big challenge or opportunity that happens in it. The big thing about this middle piece here is that we just stay clear, 2 things. We stay clear on who's involved, right? So we're painting a clear picture of what the organization did, what the client did, what maybe some staff or volunteers did, et cetera, and that there's a good flow to it. So it makes sense from, again, you're going to be communicating the story to an audience that may have much less background in the issue or work than you or your clients do, right? They may not at all be familiar with the actual kind of challenge or reality or community that you're doing the work in or the clients live in. So it's important that there's a clear flow there and that folks can kind of follow along. And then finally, for an ending, we want an ending that feels like an ending, right? If you all have ever seen a show or movie that feels like that ending's open-ended, there may not be a more frustrating feeling, right? Same for this, right? When folks read these stories, they want to know there's an end. And again, we don't want to oversell this. We'll talk about this a little bit later. We're talking about kind of telling stories with an eye towards justice. But we don't want to try to say at the end of this, and now that person lived happily ever after, and there were no more challenges ever. Especially our younger educated donors know that just isn't true, right? You know, and we're not going to necessarily solve all problems because of one programmatic intervention we have with a client, but wanting to make sure that we finish this story. So again, not talking about necessarily the future, but making sure that this story, this kind of intervention did have a wrap on it, and it was clear kind of how it was resolved. And then finally, the what. And this is just a reminder that throughout both the who and the how, we really want to make sure that we're appealing to the emotions of the audience and using a lot of details. Those details and visuals are going to be key, and they help us be able to paint a picture without having to be overly, emotional in the language that we're using. If we're able to paint an accurate enough picture, the emotion's going to be there in and of itself. In terms of kind of tapping into the emotions of the audience, the biggest thing is just really thinking about our language. How do we use a really emotive language, really be purposeful with the words we're saying, and making sure the way we're describing things are as descriptive and purposeful as possible. And finally, when you're thinking about the narrative arc of our stories, we're thinking about this in two ways. We're thinking about this both within every story we tell. We want there to be a really good narrative, but then also across the stories we tell over a certain period of time, how are they building together to create a narrative across multiple stories that we might be sharing? So part of this is really thinking about the focus of our stories, right? So not just sharing one type of story. If I looked at kind of all the stories you share over a month or a quarter of the year, there should be a variety between client impact stories, staff stories, some stories from community or supporters, and maybe even one or two stories from just the organization's perspective as a whole. The goal here is that we feel really comprehensive across, again, either a monthly, quarterly, or annual cycle. And no one's going to necessarily say that. No one's going to reach out to you and say, hey, I really love the diversity of your stories. But subconsciously, it's going to make them feel like a lot of things are happening, right? If they just hear the same great story over and over again, we're just switching out the character name, they're going to connect with that part of our work, but they're going to feel like it's a little one-dimensional. If instead, we're making it really about all the work as a whole, it's going to make folks feel a lot more connected to it, a lot more like, hey, a lot of things are happening daily. This is an organization I need to support. It's also important here, I'll say too, on the focus part, if you have diverse programming, so you have programs that are very different in scope, right? It all rolls up to one mission, but very different in how they kind of impact the community. We want to make sure we're balancing the stories we're telling there too. That again is going to tell a story. If we run an after school program and also a one-on-one tutoring program, and we only share stories from after school, it's going to start telling the community what we're prioritizing, even if that's not what we're trying to do. So I want to think about how we're balancing that across programs as well. On a monthly basis, we want to try to keep at least one story being shared monthly. We say this as kind of a minimum. We know capacity is always the challenge. And if this isn't possible, we always say start where you can, right? So if that's one story every other month, great. If that's one story a quarter, great. But we see kind of getting to at least a monthly story, a monthly highlight that you're sharing, be kind of a minimum to kind of help start engaging the audience and thinking, okay, this is something that happens really regularly. We want it to feel like stories are happening naturally, not that we're like, going out there picking the best stories, even though we probably are, and sharing those as they come up, right? Instead, we want to kind of make it feel like, oh yeah, things are happening every day here. Great impacts happening all the time. Here's a couple of examples recently, right? So we don't want to make it feel overly special that we have a story. I want it to feel like it's a normal thing that we have and can share. This is really important to pre-plan. So especially if we have a slower programmatic time or a busier operations fundraising time, planning these stories ahead of time is going to be really helpful for us. And that's why when we get to the managing and collecting part here in a minute, we'll talk about how to spread those out, collect those ahead of time, and make sure we have those in kind of a story bank to be able to use when we actually get to sharing them out. And then the only thing I would say on the sharing more, we had this asked us once, can I share too many stories? And I think that would be hard to do, but I would say if you're sharing more than kind of 1 or 2 a week, then it's going to start feeling a little bit like the audience can't necessarily kind of latch on to any one of them. So I'd probably keep it to 1 or 2 a week, but most of us do not have the capacity or the time to exceed that to begin with. But anywhere from that monthly to kind of weekly ratio is going to be completely fine and definitely not overwhelming for the audience. And then finally, mode-wise, think about the fact that our stories don't always have to be shared in completely the same way. Obviously, a lot of times it makes sense for us just to, excuse me, write the story up on a blog, right? Share it on social, drop a link in an email, and then we're done. But there's a lot of other ways we could share that story, right? Stories can be visual, or at least have a strong visual component. We want some of our stories to be shorter, longer. Again, some to address certain goals, other to address others. Some on certain audiences, other on others. The more that we can vary them, the better. And again, it's going to make it feel more natural that there's not kind of a set format that people are like, oh yeah, this is a story that nonprofit XYZ is sharing. It always follows this format. We want to change that up a little bit so again, it feels more authentic. Then finally, in terms of kind of getting our stories out there, we want to, again, make sure we have a strong visual component. We have images and writing that are really reinforcing each other. It doesn't have to be a photo of the client or the interaction we're describing. Just a representative photo would be great. If we don't have a photo or can't use photos because the type of work we do, a representative graphic would be great there, right? Even if it's a graphic that's pulling out a quote or pulling out a stat from the story. I want to make sure we're sharing across our social media networks, even if we're not that active on social. It's great to get the story out there. You never know what's going to connect with someone. And if we already have it on a blog or email, we want to use it as widely as we can to make sure it gets kind of all the attention that it's able to. I want to make sure that, this gets back to, again, that distracted and tired audience, that we're making our stories concise. So it's easier to share a short and focused message. So we still want to share, the nuance, the context, the detail, the flow we talked about earlier. But we want to make sure we're trying to keep it relatively concise. So it's a 5-minute or less read is going to make it most likely that people are going to engage with it. Media, we want to make sure that we're thinking about it on a digital medium, that we're writing it. Consider video. Video is a great way to share stories that we don't usually think about. But those can be super easy. We do see audience engage a lot with really authentic videos just shot on an iPhone in someone's office. So it doesn't have to be super fancy, but that can be a really good way to drive engagement, especially if you're sharing on social media. Tone of the story, we typically, and this is going to vary a little bit in the organization, your culture, the audience you're communicating to, but generally speaking, we want the tone to be relatively conversational, or at the very least, we don't want it to be overly professional in the sense of like, hey, we're an expert and look at this perfect story of impact. We wanted to share more as kind of a conversational or kind of professional, but still in a relatable sense that, hey, here's a story that happened. And we wanted to share this with you so you knew more about what's happening in the community and about how we're addressing some of the challenges or opportunities that our neighbors are facing. And then finally, if you don't have a blog, there's a lot of free platforms out there. You can embed it on your website pretty easily. We still see these get pretty good engagement. I'm pretty great, especially when new people come to your site. They also will go there and read a couple. So if able, and you're already writing stories, a great thing to just put it on a blog as well, linked to your site. And even if there's not a ton of traffic right away, it's not a lot of additional work. Then the final piece about stories themselves before we switch to that managing and collecting piece get asked a lot of times with nonprofit storytelling, how to tell stories with an eye towards justice and equity, right? And telling these stories in a way that we feel good about as an organization. So a couple of tips here. This is obviously a big topic, so we're not going to cover it entirely right now, but happy to answer questions about it if folks have them later. One is that it's really important to listen to the community that we're getting stories from about what they'd want to share, right? And how they talk about the work. So we're being authentic to the way the community is often describing the work and the impact that we're having. Secondly, obviously, if we're actually taking quotes or stories from clients or community that we're getting consent before identification or even just using that representative story, I want to make sure that if my clients, my audience, my community read that story, that they would feel okay about it. I want to give the option that people are giving me feedback or telling a story anonymously. And there's ways that we can do this, right? We can either use a pseudonym, right? So make a name up for someone. We also see a lot of times, preemptively, I'll say we get this question a lot about, I work with a protected population. I can't tell individual stories in case it risks identification of a client. For those cases, we often see folks tell stories that are basically representative. So they're not necessarily the whole story of one individual client. They might be pieced together from a couple, but they feel like they represent the general client that the organization gets. That's completely fine. That kind of composite story. And that's one way we see folks handle that. And then the other thing that can be helpful is getting the opinion from other people about what takeaway the story gives, right? So you may have a goal in mind for the story, an emotion you're trying to evoke the story, but it may or not be actually what people are picking up on. So having other people read it over first could be a great way to kind of get a sense of, is the story communicating the thing I want it to? Two things I want to avoid here. One is overly dramatizing the story, right? The stakes are already high enough. The work's already important enough. We don't need to make it up, right? We don't need to make it more dramatic or aggressive than it already is. One thing we've seen some organizations do for this, for instance, is they don't talk about anything that happened in their client's life prior to their work with the nonprofit. So they're not going to tell the kind of whole backstory, right, and try to kind of get the sympathy from that. They're just going to talk about the intervention and the progress story. Every organization is going to choose how to do this differently. There's not necessarily a right or wrong answer, but making sure that how we're telling stories aligns with our values is really important. All right, for the remainder of today, for about the next 20-25 minutes, we'll talk about collecting and managing these stories, right? So if you have a great idea for a story, you have your narrative arc, right? You have your goals you want to hit with your stories. How do I actually find these stories, collect them, and manage them and use them effectively? That's what we'll spend the next, again, 20-25 minutes talking about. So the first, again, so another way to think about the different story types that we talked about before, and we'll reframe them a little bit just because it'll be helpful when we're thinking about the collection of them, but as a type of story we want to tell. So in addition to the type of goals we want to hit with our stories and who the main character is of our stories, we may be telling stories that, again, most commonly are the on-the-ground stories. So these are our impact stories, the stories about our clients, about the difference that we're making with them, about what's working, what's not in our programming, what challenges and opportunities are out there in the community. So that on the ground, that's going to be the most common story we're telling, and again, the most impactful we see often for donors and volunteers especially. Our second one is a behind the scenes story. And this is one that honestly, we didn't see get as much traction back in kind of 2018 or earlier, but has gotten a lot more over the last couple of years and still continues to get pretty good engagement from folks right now, which is really kind of a story that's more about how you do your work, how you prepare for your work, right? So it could be a picture of a crazy note card layout that you're using for curriculum design, right? It could be a picture from your staff development day. It could be, a picture from your staff going to a conference or training about something that they're going to use in their work, right? But something that's showing all the effort that goes into making this happen, and then talking about that from a staff perspective about why it matters. It's a good way to highlight some unique elements of your work, right? Especially if you have a unique or kind of work heavy process for doing what you do, can be good things to share in that behind the scenes story. The third, and this is a really important one to have, is your origin story. So how you all got founded, right? What that founding story is. It is rare, if not never, that a nonprofit got founded just because someone was like, yeah, I should start an organization, right? Or I really want to fundraise, let me start a nonprofit. There's almost always a story of passion there. Either of someone seeing something in the community that they want to help with, someone being directly impacted by something in the community, someone seeing something impact their neighbors, right? Their children, their family. And there's almost always, again, that story of kind of passion, of struggle, of hard work and dedication. And those are stories that people really latch onto and that people really get excited by. So trying to think about what is our origin story? How do we tell that founding story in a way that really motivates folks? And how do we tell that story from where we started to where we are now? For some of us, that might be a very short time, but for others, that may be a really interesting story, right, about how we've evolved over the years to be the organization we are today from that passionate founding story. And if we get that right, that kind of, we started from this moment of passion and interest and love for the community, and now we've evolved into this organization that's over here doing this great work today. That can be a really motivating story for donors and supporters, volunteers, and community members to hear. And then finally, outside of the work we're doing ourselves, kind of who we are and the impact we're having, telling those supporter stories. So finding a way to highlight stories from donors and volunteers that are going to both lift them up. It obviously helps with their individual engagement. It obviously helps other people see themselves potentially as donors and volunteers. Sometimes it's helpful for them to realize, oh, that volunteer wasn't retired. They didn't have 20 hours of volunteer a week. They just volunteered 3 hours a week on the weekend while working full time. Or they donated, but they're not a multimillionaire, right? So sometimes it helps people to see those examples from donors and volunteers to see themselves as it. It also tells them if they are a current donor or volunteer that there's a real appreciation of what they're doing and how they're supporting. So the second tip here, and this is really getting into how we get these stories from the team, right? So for most of us, we probably have at most a one-person development shop, maybe two. Many of us are probably just an executive director doing development on the side, right? As much as we're able to. And in the majority of cases, we're gonna have to go to other people to get the stories we're gonna be sharing. We might be doing direct programming ourselves as well, but there's probably others doing it at the organization also or doing it more often. So we're going to need our team or volunteers to help us in capturing those stories to be able to share out. I may not be directly there to get those stories myself. So a couple of things we can do here. And we'll talk about a few more kind of structural things here in a second as well. But one is to really incentivize this. And it doesn't have to be a tangible incentive. We'll talk about some intangible ones as well. But it could be something that's just like as easy as like a small gift card, right? A small amount of time off, or something for like the best story or most stories submitted over a certain period of time. Those little rewards actually go a long way in making folks feel energized and prioritized to share those stories with the development team or with the executive director. So that small reward can be a really good option. We'll talk about how to kind of award that and how to collect those stories here in a second. We can try to reinforce this through one-on-one personal congratulations, right, and appreciation. So telling individual staff, thank you for kind of capturing stories, sharing those stories, and especially if this is coming from the ED or a senior development person, that can mean a lot and be really motivating for the program team to continue to capture those stories. We can highlight someone, and this is one we'll spend a little bit of time on here. Highlight someone at a staff meeting for capturing a certain story, right? So again, this could be story of the week or story of the month. It could be kind of most stories submitted over a certain period of time. But highlighting that and also highlighting the story itself at a team meeting can be a really powerful way to reinforce that habit as part of team culture, to remind people about the impact we have, and to help really kind of encourage folks to want to do this. I'll say we've heard many examples of folks doing a story of the week, story of the month, and we'll talk about again how we kind of do the submission of that in a second. But picking one of those stories a week, a month to highlight, and staff actually getting really excited about getting chosen, right? They want to win. They want to be highlighted for the work they're doing, for the impact they're having, for the story that they captured. And that has greatly increased for a lot of organizations the amount of stories program staff submit. So something to consider there. Along those lines, we want to gamify this, right? Make it fun and friendly competition for staff a little bit if that fits our organizational culture. And make sure that folks know that we're not just taking these stories to take them, not just going to sit in a database. And ultimately reminding them it's not even just to share them with donors or volunteers to get them excited. Ultimately, we want to collect these stories to be able to drive more support to make more stories, right? At the end of the day, that's what we really care about. We want to use these stories to get more resources and support to do the work that's going to make more stories in the future. And I think reminding, especially programmatic staff, of that been really important for developing that philanthropic culture at the organization, and them understanding that we're not just fundraising to fundraise, we're fundraising to do more work and make more impact. Third tip here, we want to make sure it's really easy for staff to do this. So again, if we go back to the very first slide we shared today, our teams have a lot on their plates, right? They're tired. We know that burnout and kind of low engagement are common in the nonprofit sector right now. Folks have really been kind of sprinting a marathon, right? For a long time, it feels like. So we want to make it as easy as possible for staff to submit stories to us and for us to be able to kind of review those. So a couple of things. One, we want to make sure that there's a digital path for them to submit, so it doesn't require them to hop on a Zoom, call us, send us a additional kind of email out of their way. We want to make sure that there's a standing email address, an easy place they can send stories to anytime, 24/7. We want to make the submission quick. They don't need to write the whole story for us. They just need to tell us a little bit about what happened, enough that we can both start to build out the story and remind them of what they were mentioning, so that if we go back to them in 2 weeks, they'll actually remember what they were talking about, right, in that submission. So 3 minutes or less, just some basic questions about what's the story about, what program was involved, what staff was involved, what client was involved, what happened, what's the result, right? Like just a couple of quick questions there. Emphasizing them, it doesn't need to be perfect. This is for internal. You are going to rewrite this. It doesn't need to be well written or anything. It can just be some bullet points and quotes. That would be totally fine. And you want to give them some examples for that so they kind of know what you're looking for. Secondly, we want to think about giving them some opportunities to share those stories one-on-one. Depending on the culture of your organization, these can be just kind of impromptu. You hop in and kind of say hi, or it can be scheduled. Aiming for just kind of a 5 or 10 minute chat to ask them some questions, hopefully, and cover some stories. A lot of times what we see is programmatic staff are humble enough about their work. They're like, I don't have any stories to share, which is almost always not true, right? There's almost always stories that they have that you would actually love to be sharing with donors and volunteers, that donors and volunteers would find really motivational, but staff see it as just like another day at the office, right? So think about what questions can I ask to help them understand what stories I'm looking for. I want to try to get some additional details in the moment if they do start sharing a good story, and then tell them that we'll circle back, obviously, for their sign off on this, for approval on it, and permission if we need to get that from clients. And then finally, the last thing here, I'm making it easier for staff, and just being really specific about what you need or don't need, emphasizing it can be short, easy, it doesn't have to be professionally written. They can just throw something down there. And you'll follow up to get more detail. So if they feel like they didn't give you enough, you'll always come back and ask for more. And finally, if we start kind of motivating staff to submit these stories, right? So we have this easy way for them to submit. We've gamified it. We made it part of the culture. People are excited to do this. Now I have all these stories. What do I do with them, right? I still have limited capacity. How do I sort through these? The first thing we're going to do here is sort stories. We're usually just going to keep these in Excel, right? So we can take it from the email or survey that we're using, right? Drop these into an Excel document. And we're going to want to have at least one column in there that's about the source, right? Who sent me the story, so I can go back to them. And also a column in there about like, what's this story about? What program does it relate to? So I can easily filter by program and by source. We want to do this as stories come in, or at least on a weekly basis, so we don't fall too far behind. I want to look in the content of the story for any specific actions, supports, or outcomes, right? So specifically, it's about, we're an education nonprofit and it's talking about graduation, right? We're an education nonprofit, it's talking about college admission, right? Talking about test scores or something like that. If it mentions anything specific, we want to have that as a tag if that's something we're going to use regularly. All that means is that if we have in column kind of B or C, right, whatever, the actual story itself, in the column next to it, we might have some tags, right? Or tag number 1, tag number 2. For tag number 1, it might say college admission. For tag number 2, it might say self-confidence. And those are 2 things we look for across our stories. When they have them, we write them in there. Another story on that same Excel, right, might have self-confidence as tag number 1, and then tag number 2 is better grades, right? So whatever our common tags might be, we're putting those in, and no more than 3, because that takes a lot of time if we start sorting that detailed, but 1 to 3 tags per story, so that later, 2 months from now, I can go back, and if I'm looking for a story about a student feeling more self-confident at school, I can quickly search for it by filtering on the tags on my Excel sheet. This is a very basic form of qualitative data analysis by doing this. And then finally, we may also add a column in there about how we plan to use the story. So some stories are going to be appropriate to use with staff, to use with the general public, for volunteers, for donors, for clients. So making sure we read through that and think about, can we use this for anyone, or is there a specific audience we should be using this for? We can add that tag or that column after you kind of finish reading that story. And then finally, we really want to embed the story collection, right? So staff keep collecting stories long term. After we've been doing this for a couple of months, ask staff about the submission process, right? Especially if we're not getting a lot of stories in, and figure out where the pain point is, right? Why is this not happening? Is it just not a priority? Is it clunky? Is it actually taking people a lot of time? Do they not know how to use it? Wanting to make sure it's really easy for them. Secondly, want to keep it top of mind. Just saying this once is not going to work, right? So want to remind staff about this, make sure it's mentioned at multiple team meetings, make sure that there's some emails sent about it on a relatively regular basis. So we're not kind of pestering the program team, but we are kind of keeping it top of mind and present for them until it becomes a habit. And then finally, we want to reference these stories when we're talking at team meetings and individual conversations, at department meetings, etc. And why it's really important to do that is the more we build these stories into our internal culture, the more the culture is going to drive more of these stories up, right? So when people feel like storytelling is just part of who we are, they're going to naturally be doing this as a program team. Couple next steps, and I'll pause for questions. Decide what kind of stories you need, right? Set those goals we talked about earlier. Pick one of the ways we talked about to begin to motivate staff to share those stories with you. Think about kind of a standing way that you can share stories internally, right? So there's a way that you can kind of get those stories from the program team. Make sure we highlight a story and whoever shared it with us in the next month. So we begin to encourage that behavior, that action. Figure out a way we can sort those stories, start using some of those tags. And then finally, thank staff as we begin to gather those stories. So with that, I'll pause here and take any questions that come up.
Okay, thanks, Matt. And I have had some questions and comments come in, so thank you to those who have submitted. You still have some time. If there are some thoughts rattling around in your brain, please send them my way. And Matt, I particularly like your tangible ideas there for helping people put in place systems to make this part of their culture. And I suspect if we were in person in a workshop, somebody might say, well, we don't have the time for that. And I hear that comment. It makes sense. But also the flip side of that is if you're committed to this and you're going to do this type of storytelling, that's probably going to save you time in the end to set up these tags and to create those systems and to actually put that organizational process in place. So it may seem like a lift up front, but as you're considering what that looks like in your organization, maybe in the long run, it will save you time. So great thoughts there, Matt. So first question we received, it says that I'm not a good verbal storyteller, but I am good writing about our organization's story. What tips could help me become stronger as a verbal storyteller?
Sure. Yeah. So I think the biggest thing there, if you're trying to use some of these stories when you're kind of meeting with a donor one-on-one, right, or out in the community talking at a civic association meeting or something like that, is really thinking about what are the key bullet points for the flow of that narrative again, right? We often see when telling a story that we're trying to share from, especially from kind of community impact, having a few bullet points, then forcing yourself to kind of fill in the gap actually often ends up being a more authentic story than writing out a complete script of it. So obviously, if you need that script to begin with, that can be a helpful place to start. But 4 or 5 bullet points that really focus on the main part of who's the story about, what are the big things that happen, what's the call to action at the end, and maybe if you have one impact quote from the client, including that to make sure you get it right, that can be a good kind of scaffold to kind of build that story on.
Yeah. Second is more of a comment, but open to thoughts here. We had a capital campaign that involved many stories. What I realized is that it wasn't about the building or the physical space. It was about the impact of our work and what would be possible in that physical space. Just my 2 cents. So.
Definitely. And I think this is really important when a lot of times we have organizations ask about, especially this time of year, how do I fundraise for like more staff, right? How do I fundraise for a building expansion? Because those aren't necessarily the things that really excite donors, right? Donors don't necessarily wake up saying, most of them at least, I really want to pay for salary today, but they do want to pay for impact. So the story is really important there to often talk about the fact that, hey, here's how our staff directly caused this difference, right? Here's how our space was a part of this story that had this really big impact. Help us continue that story, right? To really put the impact front and center, not necessarily the tangible investment you're going to be making.
Yeah, and some of that goes back to one of your first points, which is consider your audience. So if if that donor that you're talking to has an affinity for capital projects, you can focus in on that capital project. But like to your point, there are others who are really just focused on the good work you're doing and your impact, and tell me a little bit about that. So yeah, it can go both ways. Next up, what are the best practices for sharing on social media, particularly with regard to best platform to share stories, story length, telling a full story versus a short part of it, with a read more here at the bottom, etc.
Definitely. So we would recommend the short with a read more. So a shorter version of the story, right? That's kind of teasing it out, maybe even highlighting a little bit of the impact, but like click here to read more, right? That's also what gets the most engagement. You're not going to see kind of a lot of engagement with a full link story that's on there unless you tell it via a short video. So again, you can tell a lot more in a 30-second video than you can in necessarily a narrative post you're writing. So that's one option if you want to tell more of it. The short story, the click with the read more. In terms of which platforms will be most successful, it depends on really the goal, right? And the audience. Facebook is the most successful for driving donations and volunteers, and that's just because the audience is older. Often that audience is also going to be one that's really story motivated. So that would be probably the platform I would say if I had to pick one. But at the same time, you can definitely do this really well, especially visually. Instagram kind of short thing, right? Link to more on Twitter. Things like that also work great.
Yeah, and I saw something recently that mentioned that Facebook is basically a driver of 74% of the clicks on the internet as a whole. And so if you're looking for somebody to click through to your website or to a blog post or something like that, Facebook is probably your format versus, TikTok or.
It's your most active platform for sure.
This person says, we have a lot of data that is useful when communicating with our stakeholders, but we struggle with the balance. How much is too much? When and how to weave it into stories, etc. What thoughts do you have?
Yeah, so a lot of times data and stories can go really well together, right? So either saying, I work from output data, right? Like we served 300 students to 87% of our students graduate on time. Here's a story of one of them, right? Or here's a story, and they're just one of the 300, there's one of the 87%, right? So combining our data and our stories like that are really helpful. For some folks read a story and they say that's great, but that's just one, right? What are you doing on a bigger scale? Others see the big scale stuff and say that's fine, but too impersonal. So tying those two together really makes sure we get to anyone that might be in our audience. So we often recommend balancing those and having those, if not together in the same post, thinking about that narrative arc across a week or a month. So making sure the data we're sharing kind of flows with the stories that we're sharing too.
Yeah, and some are doing that quite well in the way that they're visualizing that data. And so rather than a table with a bunch of numbers, it's maybe an infographic or a single silhouette of a child with 81% in the middle, because you've, helped 81% of young children have access to school lunches or whatever the case may be. And then that story is about that. It's reinforcing what that data is showing numerically. So
exactly, yeah. And we often encourage folks to maybe share a picture with their story, but also a graphic like that can be incredibly powerful. And that visual part of the storytelling is very important.
And this one's kind of related, with the attention spans getting shorter, it's hard to hook an audience. You mentioned a lot of upfront details to paint a picture, which is great, but might also lose some people. For a year-end appeal, I'm concerned about length of the letter while still telling a good story.
Yeah, so, and that's where we have to be just really careful with the language we're using and making sure every word carries as much weight and power as it can, because you're correct that we don't have a ton of space. So especially in the end of year letter we're printing, we probably have 1 to 2 paragraphs at most, and probably one to really share a story in, right? And one unique story. And I would invest that much real estate in it. I would make sure that I have at least kind of a short paragraph in there that's one concise story. But those details, for instance, don't have to be long, right? We don't need to share kind of the full kind of prose of everything that's happening, the lighting in the room, but we do want to make sure we're using some specific detailed language, right? Either telling them about the place, telling them about the mood, telling them about the situation, but want just enough context there, and usually just that first sentence that people understand kind of where they are when they enter into the story.
And if any of you decide to describe the lighting in the room, let me know how that goes, because I want to see if that's an effective strategy for you. Hey, that's the last question that I've received, Matt, but I do have a broader question for you, because you're familiar with DCMP and our network of 170 organizations, and all doing just incredible work here in DeKalb County. But you also work with a network out in Washington, D.C. of smaller to mid-sized nonprofits, and I'm just wondering, for the benefit of those on the call, what kind of trends are you seeing within your network of nonprofits and the network that you work with, I should say? And, is there anything that you're just seeing as kind of emerging or bubbling to the surface among that network?
Yeah, I think a big thing we see right now, and this is true both where we are, but kind of across the country, is that major donors are really engaged right now, and they are an audience that's often very engaged by stories. So folks that are giving $500,000 or more a year, and these are folks that we still see their giving elevated. They gave more in 2020, they really stepped up and have continued to step up since. So we're expecting they're going to be a big part of end of year appeals this year. And they're a very story motivated audience. Most major donors give because of an emotional connection to the work. So that's when I would really prioritize storytelling with my end of year appeal letters and end of year emails there. We are seeing grassroots and middle level donors decline a little bit, both because of compassion fatigue, economic uncertainty, et cetera. So I'd be thinking about how to kind of get those folks back engaged, maybe via a peer-to-peer campaign would be really powerful. We see some people doing that. And that's another good opportunity to have other people share their story about why they care about your organization so much.
Yeah. Thank you, Matt. We always appreciate you sharing your time and your expertise with us, and thanks for being a friend to DCMP. And we appreciate everyone who attended today. As I mentioned earlier, a follow-up evaluation will be sent by email along with the recording and the slides. So that'll be coming later on today or tomorrow. As we enter the home stretch of this year, there are still opportunities for you to maximize your DCMP membership. For example, tomorrow we have leadership lunch here at noon, here at the Community Foundation at noon. Our topic is boards of directors, and we're looking forward to a lively discussion on that topic. As we look ahead, on December 7th, we're partnering with Safe Passage and multiple chambers of commerce throughout the county to offer a webinar on sexual harassment prevention. I know many of you have completed your sexual harassment prevention training for the year. We offered one in July, but if you have staff that still need to take that annual training, this is a great way to ensure that your organization is compliant with Illinois law. And you can register for that and leadership lunch, any of our upcoming events, by visiting our website, dcmp.org. Finally, just a quick plug, we're going to be launching our 2023 DCMP membership drive very soon, and we hope that you'll renew your membership when you see that available. There'll be more details to come, but as always, you can contact us with any questions you might have at this time. So once again, Matt, it's always great to see you. Thank you very much for your time today, and we appreciate you sharing your expertise with us. Thank you all, and take care.